The str function, or the string function, will work to convert nearly any kind of variable to some kind of string. For example, the somewhat complex code shown here grabs today's date. That's what date.today gives us. But what is a date, though? We might say that we could represent a date as a year, a month, and a day, but we kind of know that a date is a more general and abstract concept. We can still use the string function, though, to convert it to a string representation. So here, line 1 runs and just tells the computer how to see today's date, or other things related to dealing with dates in general. Then line 2 runs and actually grabs the value of today's date and stores it to my date. Then line 3 runs and tries to convert my date to a string, its string representation, and store the result in my date as string. The result is that on line 4, the computer has a string representation of my date as string, to print. And sure enough, we see that it's just the year, the month, and the day. In practice, you may not always need to do this manually, though. For example, when you put a value besides a string into Python's print function, it automatically tries to convert it to a string. It basically implicitly calls that string conversion function on whatever you put inside those parentheses if it wasn't already a string. So this code does the exact same thing as the previous code. We see that the output is the same, even though we've skipped that manual type conversion. And that's just because Python understands that if we're trying to print, then we need the string version. Python implicitly calls the string function on my date in order to convert it to something it can actually print. And that's called an implicit conversion. However, there are instances where Python doesn't perform this conversion automatically. For example, we often want to provide labels for what we're printing. This makes our output a lot easier to read. So here, instead of just printing the date, we're printing the date as well as the label today's date. Today's date is in quotation marks, so we're just trying to print that string as is, and then add the value of my date. However, to put today's date, this string, and my date together, my date already has to be a string. We know how to squish two strings together, we just put one after the other. But right now, my date isn't a string, it's a date. And because this is happening inside the parentheses following print, we haven't gotten to the point where Python knows to convert it to a string automatically. So when we run this code, we first tell the code how to see dates, get the value of today's date and store it in the variable my date, and then try to print today's date, preceded by the label today's date in quotation marks. The result of this is this type error. It says type error can't convert datetime.date, which is just Python's way of saying can't convert a value of the type date, to a string implicitly. Remember we described previously that when Python just understands that it needs to convert a value to a string, it does so implicitly. This is basically saying that in this context, it can't make that implicit conversion. We need to tell it explicitly to convert this to a string. This is a bit of a complicated concept. You don't really need to understand right now what's going on behind the scenes and why this actually occurs. What you really need to understand is if you try to print multiple different types put together by a plus sign, you'll get this type error. So if you see a type error that says we can't convert implicitly, look to see where you're trying to put two different data types together. We mentioned, though, that it is value to be able to provide this kind of label when we print things out. So how do we do it correctly? Well, there's a number of different ways. We see over here on the right that today's date is printed 5 times. We see over on the left that there are 5 print statements. And so we can assume that each one of these successfully prints out today's date. Let's look at how each of them work. When the computer runs line 1, it just learns how to interpret dates and deal with dates. When it runs line 2, it gets today's date and stores it in my date as before. When it gets to line 3, it explicitly converts my date to a string. And then on line 4, it tries what we did before to put them together. Here, today's date is a string, as we can see by the quotation marks. And my date as string is a string because we just created it using the string conversion on the value of my date. Because they're both strings, that plus sign can work. It knows how to put two different strings together. And so it correctly prints the date on that first line. Going forward, the computer ignores line 5 because it's blank. We sometimes use blank lines like this just to make our code easier to read. Line 6 is the same as line 3, except instead of getting the value of today's date and storing it in my date, we're instead just putting it into that string conversion function directly. The value being put into that string conversion function is the same either way. In lines 2 and 3, it was just temporarily stored in my date, whereas in line 6, it's put directly into the function. So either way, the same value is being assigned to my date as string. And so when we run line 7, today's date is a string, as given by the quotation marks. My date is a string because we just converted it from a string. And so this correctly prints today's date, again on the second line. Moving forward, when we get to line 9, the computer again gets the value of today's date and assigns it to my date. Now we didn't actually need to do this because it's still there from line 2. We're doing this again on line 9 just to kind of demonstrate what it would be like to do it from scratch each time. Each section of code between the spaces can pretty much stand on its own, as long as each of them is preceded by line 1. Then when the computer runs line 10, it puts the string conversion directly inside the print statement. This does the exact same thing as our first method. We create my date and give it the value of today's date, and then before printing it, we convert it to a string using the string conversion function. The only difference is that in our first method, we temporarily store the value into a variable, whereas here, we're just doing it inside the print statement. This is a subtle point, but it's pretty powerful. When we called the function earlier to convert myDate to a string, we put its value in myDate as string, and then used myDate as string as a value in our print statement. That value was returned by that string conversion function. This string conversion function returns the exact same value. And so when the computer runs this print statement, the first thing it tries to do is run that function on the inside. That function generates the exact same string, and then after the function is run, it's basically replaced by the result. It's replaced by the string representing the date. The same thing happens on line 4. When it tries to print this, it looks up the value of myDate as string and replaces the variable name with that string. Either way, the result is the same. Print the label today's date, followed by that value. So it doesn't matter if we store the string representation of the date in a variable or just put it directly into the print statement. Either way, it's going to be converted to the same value and printed just the same. Going forward, that means we can make this even more efficient, at least in terms of the number of lines of code we have to write. On line 12, we don't even bother storing today's date into the variable myDate. The same thing applies here. Date.today returns the value of today's date. We could store that into a variable and then put that into our string conversion function, or we can just put it directly into our string conversion function as it is. Now we can tell this is starting to get pretty complicated. Just look at how many parentheses are needed to close that line. 3 different parentheses. That means there are 3 different functions or methods being called. So let's trace through how it runs this. I mentioned before you can generally assume that whenever Python runs a line of code like this, it's going to start with the innermost function, or the one inside the most parentheses. Here, that's going to be date.today, because it's inside the string function, which itself is inside the print function. So what happens when it resolves date.today? Well, it basically replaces that with the actual value it would return, which in this case is September 22nd, 2016. Now note that this isn't in quotation marks. That's because right now it's actually a date, not just a text representation of a date. We just can't really talk about dates without putting them in terms of text. So now it's resolved that innermost function, or that innermost method. Instead of having to resolve date.today, it now has today's date. Now it needs to convert that to a string representation like the ones that we see over here. So it calls the function to convert that date into a string, and the result of that is that this entire thing is now replaced by that string representation. Note that the quotation marks indicate that this is a string. So now our print statement prints this string, today's date, plus that string. And so we get the 4th line of our output. These 4 methods are used because they demonstrate type conversions between dates and strings. In practice, though, we'll usually do something a little bit different. Notice that when the computer runs line 14, it's still successful at printing the exact same text. And yet, nowhere in this line is that string function. That's because when we use this comma instead of this plus sign, it tells the print statement to interpret each individual thing in the parentheses as a separate piece of data. When we use the plus sign, Python first tries to put these 2 things together and then tries to print them. When we use this comma, on the other hand, the print statement implicitly converts each thing to a string if needed and then puts them together. By default, it puts each thing together separated by a space. And that's why you might notice that in our previous statements, we needed a space inside the label to print a space in the output. Whereas in line 14, we don't need that space because Python automatically adds it when it adds the different strings together in order to print them with that print statement.